Hi! Do you feel like the hair you draw looks flat, shapeless, or even a little empty? Well, in this video, I'm going to try to help by showing you how I personally draw and paint hair. Just a quick disclaimer, I'm not an expert or a professional artist. I'm still learning and trying to improve too, so I'd really appreciate it if we could all support each other as artists. Okay, enough talking. Let's get started. Now, let's talk about one of the most important things when drawing, references. They're really important if we want to create a result we're happy with, because sometimes our brain needs something to guide us so we can get closer to what we had in mind. So, I really recommend looking for these kinds of images on Pinterest. They can help us with the sketch, the line art, and even the coloring. Okay, first of all, we need to understand the volume and direction of the hair strands. This can be applied to pretty much any art style, so let's get into it. I used to watch tutorials where people showed how they drew strands and divided the hair depending on each area of the head and all that, but whenever I tried to apply it myself, I still didn't really understand the three-dimensional shape of the hair. For example, whenever the head was tilted upward, downward, or even shown from a three-quarter angle, I didn't know how to draw the hair from those perspectives. So, I'm going to show you how I personally do it without making things too complicated. For this part, I usually recommend looking for drawings with a perspective similar to the one you want to draw. We can analyze how the hair is constructed in that drawing and use it as a guide for our own OC or fan art. In this case, I'm going to use this Sakura Mika drawing by G. Fanjing as an example. Here, we can see the original character design that was used as a reference for the fan art. As you can see, the drawing is a little complicated, so I'm going to give you a few tips to make it easier. In this case, it's really important to separate the hair into different sections. Even though dividing every part of the hair isn't always necessary, it can help us build a base when working with more complicated drawings. Hair normally follows a direction that begins from the parting or the hair whorl, which would be somewhere around here in this case. From this area, the strands spread across the rest of the head like this. This can change depending on the hairstyle. Sometimes, the hair begins from a parting, while other times, it looks like it comes from a more noticeable central point. The important thing is deciding where the hair begins and keeping that direction consistent, so the strands don't look like they're coming from random places and the hairstyle feels more coherent. First, I'm going to mark the main sections of the character's hair, which would be these. Then, I'm going to try placing them onto the drawing. You don't need to get everything perfect immediately. Simply having a general idea of where each section goes is enough. Sometimes, we forget that hair in 2D drawings has another side. Even though we usually only see the top surface, there's also an underside that isn't always visible. What I usually do is imagine the hair as a blanket or a sheet of paper. We can grab it and fold it like this, and when we rotate it and look at it from different perspectives, we can see the underside in certain areas. Well, something similar happens with hair in 2D drawings. Keeping that hidden side in mind can help us give the hair more volume and make it feel more three-dimensional. Even when the strands are very small, movement, wind, or a more dynamic pose can make the underside visible and help the movement feel clearer. After that, we can start drawing the hair little by little. I don't add 394 details to every single strand. I always try to keep things simple while still making sure it looks visually appealing. And one more thing, don't be afraid to exaggerate the hair. As long as it doesn't look too weird, try to give it plenty of curves and movement, because I feel like that makes it look much prettier. To apply everything I just explained, I'm going to draw hair onto this Hatsune Miku fan art. Sorry, I love her. Okay, first, let's create a small guide showing where each section of the hair is located, the front, the back, and the sides. Then, while keeping the character's original hairstyle in mind, we can draw the basic shapes. From here, we can start forming the different strands. Now, I'm going to show you how I personally draw them. The shape of each strand depends a lot on the art style, whether it's cartoon, chibi, anime, or something else. But since I'm working with an anime style in this case, I recommend making the ends of the strands pointed, because I personally think it looks prettier. After drawing the main strands, we can add a few more in the areas that look a little empty, like these parts here. These strands should also follow the direction we marked earlier, but they don't necessarily need to reach the very ends of the hair. We can make them stop earlier to create the illusion of overlapping strands and add a little more volume. And with that, the hair sketch is finished. This part can vary a lot depending on each person's style. Some artists use very thick lines, others use thinner ones, some use brushes with a messier texture, and others prefer a cleaner finish. I usually make my line art with a clean brush, and the thickness depends on the type of drawing I'm working on. If the drawing is very detailed, I normally use thinner lines so it doesn't look too heavy or strange with thick line art. But if I'm drawing a headshot like the example we're working on, I use a brush size that's somewhere between thin and thick. I also really recommend increasing the brush stabilization a little to prevent the lines from looking too shaky. Just don't increase it too much, because it can make the brush feel slow or uncomfortable. Okay, let's start drawing the lines. I usually draw each strand from the inside toward the outside, because that makes it easier for me to create pointed ends. Another tip, don't obsess over making the line art 100% perfect or completely closed just to make the coloring process easier later. In both applications, the fill tool has a setting that allows it to close or ignore small gaps in the line art, preventing the color from leaking through them. This makes coloring much easier. I also have another tip for Clip Studio Paint users. There's a feature called a vector layer, which can be extremely helpful for line art. I don't want to get too technical, so I'll just say that using vector layers gives us access to tools like these. For example, we can erase lines that stick out much more easily, edit the strokes using these control points, and resize them without losing as much quality. I personally don't use vector layers very often because I don't find them very comfortable, but if you didn't know they existed, they're definitely worth trying. And with that, we can finish the line art. I would usually leave it like this, but some artists recommend making the lines slightly thicker in areas where several lines connect, where one strand overlaps another, or where we want to suggest a small shadow. You can look for references on Pinterest or watch videos that explain these kinds of line art techniques really well. First of all, I want to clarify that this stage depends a lot on what feels most comfortable for each person. I usually keep every base color on its own separate layer. For example, one layer for the skin, another for the clothes, another for the hair, and so on. That makes it much easier for me to adjust the colors individually later. I almost always add some kind of gradient to the base color of the hair, because I feel like it makes it look prettier and less flat. Personally, I sometimes like adding a bright, light color to the inner part of the hair, making the ends slightly darker, or even adding a gradient using the character's skin color. It all depends on the effect and atmosphere I want to create. If I'm working on a dark scene, which I do pretty often, I like adding a bright and vibrant color to the inner part of the hair, along with darker ends. I feel like that helps the character stand out more. But if I want a softer, creamier atmosphere, I usually add a gradient using the character's skin color to the front sections of the hair. That helps the hair blend slightly into the face and gives the drawing a softer look. And finally, we've reached my favorite part, coloring. I love coloring. I change the way I render hair quite often, because it depends on how I want the final drawing to look. But I always try to guide myself using references from artists whose work I like. The first thing I do is decide where the light is coming from. In this case, I'm going to keep it simple. The light will come from the front and slightly above. Now, we create a multiply layer, select the base color of the hair, and start adding shadows to the areas where the light wouldn't reach, or behind overlapping strands, to make the hair feel more three-dimensional. If the shadow looks too saturated, you can lock the alpha using this button and recolor it with a slightly more muted tone. After finishing this step, I usually create another multiply layer using the same color and go over some of the areas we already darkened. But this time, I add much smaller sections of shadow. This helps define the hair more clearly and gives the shadows a more interesting effect. Also, if you added a lighter color to the inner part of the hair, try not to add too much shadow there so that detail still looks bright. And with that, the basic shading is finished. Now, I'm going to show you a few tips I've seen other artists use that have honestly worked really well for me. First, we select the shadow area we created on the multiply layer. After that, we create another layer and use the airbrush to add a soft red tint, or any other warm color, around the edges of the shadows. You can test it and decide whether you like the result, but I personally really love how it looks. Another tip I like using is creating another layer and adding a little light blue, or gray, with the airbrush to the areas that are farthest away from the light. This is more of a stylistic choice than an actual rule, so just try it and see if it works with your drawing. And with that, the shadows are pretty much finished. Now, we need to add more details to the front of the hair so it doesn't look too empty. And honestly, this is the point where I don't really know how to explain exactly what I'm doing, because I usually paint without thinking too much. But basically, I create a normal layer and slowly add colors until I like how it looks. For example, here, I would draw a few curved shapes around the middle of the hair using a slightly grayish color, and then bring them down toward the lower part of the strand to create this effect. And on the upper parts of the strands, I would add a few shadows similar to the ones we created earlier. And that's more or less how I render the front part of the hair. Basically, I guide myself using references and keep painting until I feel like it looks pretty. Finally, once the render is finished, we can color the line art. For this, I choose a slightly darker color based on the darkest area of the hair. I don't add highlights to the hair very often, but when I do, I usually draw this weird shape, adjust it a little using the finger or smudge tool, and then set the layer to add glow. Lastly, I want to show you one way I add more detail to the hair and make it look really cool. First, we create a new layer above the line art. Then, using the direction we marked earlier as a guide, we start drawing small loose strands. Some of them can point inward toward the main shape of the hair, while others can stick slightly outside of the silhouette. For each strand, I select the color from the area where I want it to begin. After adding all the small strands, I draw a few lines around them using the same color I chose for the line art. And with that, the hair render is finally finished. Well, that's everything, guys. If there was any part that wasn't completely clear, feel free to ask me anything in the comments. This is my first time making a tutorial, so I'd also really appreciate any advice. Please subscribe and support the video by leaving a like, because it would help me a lot. See you!